What if I told you that the most powerful weapons in history weren't swords or spears, but the humble tools people used every single day? Picture a simple hammer resting on a blacksmith's bench, or a farmer's sickle lying in a field. After harvest, objects so ordinary, we might walk right past them without a second thought. Yet these very items, these unassuming relics of daily life, have sparked revolutions, toppled empires, and become enduring symbols of human defiance across thousands of years of history. They were born from necessity, shaped by human hands to build and create, but when pushed to the brink, ordinary people transformed them into something extraordinary, silent witnesses to courage, unity, and the unbreakable will to resist. In this video, we're going to uncover the hidden stories behind these ancient artifacts of rebellion. We'll journey from the spinning rooms where women used their distaffs to plan quiet revolts, to the fields where farmers raised their sickles not just to harvest crops, but to demand dignity and justice. We'll explore how blacksmiths' hammers forged both metal and myths of resistance, and how weaving looms became secret networks of communication and solidarity. These objects connect us to moments when everyday people, often forgotten by history, found ingenious ways to say enough using the very tools that defined their lives. Their creativity in the face of oppression reminds us that symbolism can be as powerful as any army, and that the most potent forms of protest often emerge from the most unexpected places. This exploration isn't just about understanding the past, it's about recognizing patterns that still echo today. As we delve into these stories of ancient resistance, you might find yourself looking at the world around you differently, wondering what ordinary objects in our own time might one day become symbols of courage and change. So join me as we step into the fascinating intersection of utility and uprising, where common tools became extraordinary emblems of the human spirit's refusal to be broken. What we discover might just change how you see history and humanity forever. To truly grasp the profound transformation of these objects into symbols of defiance, we must first journey back to a time when they were simply tools. Not yet loaded with metaphorical weight, they were the unsung heroes of daily existence, the quiet partners in humanity's struggle for survival and community. Imagine the rhythm of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Rome. Before the first light of dawn, the farmer's hand would already be gripping the worn wooden handle of his plow, guiding it through the stubborn earth. His success, and that of his entire village, depended on this simple yet revolutionary implement that turned wild soil into life-giving fields. Every meal, every traded good, every ounce of economic stability was tied directly to the efficacy of these essential instruments. They were not merely objects, they were extensions of the human body and will, amplifying effort and making civilization itself possible. The significance of these tools extended far beyond their practical function. They were central to social identity and cultural cohesion. Take the blacksmith's forge, for instance. In countless ancient towns, the smithy was far more than a workshop. It was a bustling hub of innovation and interaction. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil was the soundtrack of progress, a signal that tools were being repaired, weapons forged, and new ideas literally taking shape in fire and metal. People gathered here, sharing news and gossip, making the forge a nexus of the community's social and economic life. Similarly, the potter's wheel was a center of artistry and trade. A potter spinning clay into vessels for storing grain, water, and wine was not just a craftsperson but a vital node in the distribution of resources. Their creations facilitated storage, transport, and commerce, making them indispensable to the local economy. In this context, these tools were so deeply woven into the fabric of normalcy, so utterly commonplace, that their potential for symbolic power remained completely unseen. They were the background noise of existence, utterly essential yet completely taken for granted. This deep integration into the mundane is precisely what would later make their transformation so potent. A sickle was for centuries just a sickle, a curved blade used to cut down crops at harvest time. It spoke of hard work, the changing seasons, and the satisfaction of a full granary. A woman's spindle and distaff were simply the instruments she used to perform her daily task of spinning wool or flax into thread, a never-ending chore essential for clothing her family. There was no inherent rebellion in these objects. Their meaning was defined solely by their utility. They were the anchors of routine, the guarantors of stability. Yet it was this very familiarity, this universal understanding of their purpose, that laid the perfect groundwork for a powerful reimagining. When the weight of oppression eventually fell, it was upon these foundational objects of daily life. The same plow that promised sustenance could become a marker of stolen land. The same hammer that built a community could be seen forging its chains. Their ordinary nature became their greatest strength, allowing acts of defiance to be hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to awaken and transform utility into uprising. But this essential, almost sacred relationship between people and their tools could only be strained so far before it frayed and finally snapped. The very objects that symbolized stability and sustenance could, under the weight of unbearable oppression, be reforged in the fires of resentment into something entirely new. History shows us repeatedly that when systems of power, be they empires, slave states, or tyrannical rulers, push people to the absolute brink, a remarkable transformation occurs. The tools of survival are quietly, ingeniously repurposed into instruments of protest. This was never a sudden, dramatic shift, but a subtle and deeply psychological reclamation of agency. For the enslaved, the taxed, and the subjugated, these everyday items became silent allies in a hidden war of attrition, a way to carve out small pockets of freedom within a vast landscape of control. Consider the helots of ancient Sparta, an entire population bound in brutal servitude to the Spartan warrior class. Their lives were defined by back-breaking agricultural labor, their existence solely for the purpose of feeding their masters. The plow, the sickle, the hoe, these were the chains of their daily reality. Yet within that grim existence, they found ways to turn those very symbols of their oppression against their oppressors. A plow might accidentally break at a crucial time, delaying the planting season. Harvests could mysteriously yield less than expected, with portions of grain being diverted or hidden. These were not acts of open warfare, which would have been swiftly and brutally crushed, but were instead a silent, collective sabotage using the only means at their disposal. Each deliberately damaged implement, each concealed basket of grain was a tiny victory, a reassertion of control over their own labor and its fruits. It was a way of whispering, "You do not own me completely." This phenomenon was by no means unique to Sparta. In the sprawling slave markets and vast estates of ancient Rome, enslaved individuals from across the Mediterranean developed their own sophisticated language of resistance. A household slave tasked with lighting the oil lamps might arrange them in a specific pattern visible from the street, signaling a secret meeting. A cook could use a particular type of pottery vessel to serve a visiting dignitary, a covert message to allies within the household about the guest's importance or intentions. These actions transformed mundane, domestic objects into a clandestine communication network, a way to build unity and solidarity under the ever-watchful eyes of their captors. The weight of exploitation, the constant threat of violence, the separation from family, the denial of basic humanity ignited a creative spark born of sheer necessity. This wasn't just about practical rebellion, it was a profound psychological journey. To take an object that represented your powerlessness and repurpose it as a tool of your own will was an act of immense symbolic power. It was a way to mend a fractured spirit, to reclaim a sense of self, and to quietly affirm that even in chains, the human desire for freedom could not be entirely extinguished. This repurposing served as a critical foundation, a testing ground for the strategies and symbols that would later fuel more open, organized movements. It proved that resistance did not always require a sword. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was a simple tool, wielded with cunning and collective intent. It paved the way for these objects to shed their purely utilitarian identities entirely and emerge as powerful, unifying emblems. And one of the most potent and overlooked examples of this transformation begins not on the battlefield or in the forum, but in the quiet, dimly lit rooms where women gathered to spin thread. And it is precisely within these domestic spheres, often dismissed as insignificant by the broader historical record, that we find one of the most poignant examples of this transformation. In the ancient world, the rhythmic, almost meditative act of spinning thread was so intrinsically linked to womanhood that the distaff and spindle became universal symbols of the female domain. From the bustling courtyards of Rome to the quieter homes of Greece, women spent countless hours drawing out fibers, twisting them into yarn, and winding them onto spindles. This was not a hobby, it was an economic necessity. The clothing on every back, the sails on every ship, the ropes tying bundles, all began with this fundamental, unceasing labor. Yet, confined to the home and largely excluded from formal political life, women discovered that these very tools of their domestic confinement could be repurposed into instruments of subtle but powerful defiance. The spindle whorl, a small weight that gives a spindle its momentum, becomes a fascinating artifact in this story. Archaeologists have unearthed these humble clay or stone discs from sites across the Mediterranean, and some carry faint inscriptions or unique markings that hint at a deeper purpose. A whorl might be incised with a particular symbol, a shared sign among women in a community, or even a single word like steadfast or together. In a society where women's gatherings could be monitored, these small objects allowed for silent communication. Exchanging a spindle with a marked whorl could be a way of signaling solidarity, a reminder that despite their isolation in individual households, they were part of a larger, interconnected network. The act of spinning itself, often done in groups, provided the perfect cover for conversation and planning. Under the guise of this mundane, expected chore, women could share grievances, coordinate acts of non-cooperation, or support one another in disputes, their hands never stilling, their voices kept low. This covert resistance occasionally erupted into the open, and history offers us a powerful, though likely embellished, example from ancient Greece. The play Lysistrata by Aristophanes, while a comedy, is rooted in a very real understanding of women's power. In it, the women of Athens and Sparta, led by the titular character, famously withhold sexual privileges from their husbands to force an end to the Peloponnesian War. While the play is fiction, it captures an essential truth. Women recognized their collective economic and social power. There are historical accounts of women in various city-states using similar tactics, and in these moments, the tools of their trade were thrust into the spotlight. Imagine a group of women, not with swords and shields, but brandishing their distaffs and spindles, blocking a street or gathering in the agora. These were not weapons of violence, but powerful symbols. They were proclaiming, "You depend on our labor. The fabric of your society, quite literally, is woven by our hands. Our work has value, and we will withdraw it." A distaff held aloft was no longer just a stick for holding wool. It was a banner declaring their indispensable yet undervalued role. This reclamation of a gendered tool is what makes the spindle story so profound. In the hands of the patriarchy, the distaff was a symbol of limitation, defining the boundaries of a woman's world. But in the hands of women united by a common cause, it was transformed into a symbol of immense, untapped power. It became a statement that the work deemed least important, the domestic, the repetitive, the quiet, was in fact the very foundation upon which everything else was built. The spindle wall, with its silent, spinning persistence, serves as a perfect metaphor for this kind of resistance, slow, steady, and capable of weaving separate, fragile threads into an unbreakable cord of unity. It gave a voice to those the system sought to silence, proving that revolution could begin not with a shout in the forum, but with a whisper shared over the gentle hum of a spinning wheel. While the spindle symbolized a quiet, domestic resistance, another tool emerged from the fields with a far more visceral and confrontational message. Picture the sickle, a simple, curved blade designed to fit perfectly in the palm of the hand, its sharp edge honed to cleanly slice through stalks of wheat or barley. For millennia, it was a symbol of the harvest of hard-won nourishment and the cyclical nature of life and death tied to the land. But when the hands that wielded it were pushed to the absolute limit, the sickle's meaning was violently inverted. It was no longer just a tool for gathering food. It became a stark representation of the people's right to that food, and a terrifyingly effective weapon to defend that right. This transformation is captured with brutal clarity during the Sicilian slave revolts of the 2nd century BCE. On the vast, sprawling latifundia estates of the Roman elite, thousands of enslaved individuals from across the Mediterranean toiled under the blistering sun. Their lives were a relentless cycle of planting and reaping, yet they themselves often went hungry, their labor enriching distant masters in Rome while they starved. When these enslaved workers finally rose up, they did not have the luxury of forged swords or polished spears. They reached for what was at hand, the very instruments of their bondage. A sickle, in this context, was a brutally pragmatic choice. It was readily available, required no special training to use lethally, and its curved blade could inflict horrific wounds. But to see it only as a makeshift weapon is to miss its profound symbolic power. By raising a sickle in rebellion, an enslaved person was making a powerful declaration. They were asserting ownership over their own labor and its products. This blade, which had been used to enrich their oppressors, was now turned against them, physically representing the idea that the fruits of the earth belong to those who work the soil, not to those who simply own it. The revolts, led by figures like Eunice and Cleon, were ultimately crushed with characteristic Roman brutality, but the image of enslaved people armed with their agricultural tools became seared into the historical consciousness, a potent warning to the powerful and an enduring inspiration for the oppressed. This symbolism did not fade with the Roman Empire. The sickle's association with the agrarian working class ensured its place as an icon of resilience for centuries to come. In folk art, songs, and oral traditions passed down through generations of peasants, the sickle frequently appeared not as a weapon of war, but as a badge of honor. It represented a deep, almost sacred connection to the land and a stubborn demand for dignity. This was not about violent uprising so much as it was about a moral economy, the belief that those who dedicate their lives to feeding others deserve respect, security, and a fair share of the harvest. The curved blade came to symbolize the crescent of the moon under which so much harvest work was done, linking the struggle for justice to the natural, immutable cycles of the world itself. This ancient legacy directly influenced the symbol we might recognize most readily today, the hammer and sickle. While that 20th century emblem is its own complex chapter, its power drew directly from these deep historical roots. The sickle was chosen precisely because it already carried millennia of meaning as a representation of the peasantry, of collective labor, and of the righteous claim that those who work the land have a right to its bounty. Its journey from a humble harvesting tool to a universal emblem of the common people demonstrates a fundamental truth about symbolic resistance. An object does not need to be forged for battle to become powerful. It simply needs to be deeply, intimately connected to the lives and livelihoods of those who wield it. The sickle story is one of reclamation, a powerful reminder that the tools of labor can, in a moment of crisis, become the instruments of liberation. And just as the heat of the sun shaped the sickle's meaning in the field, another tool drew its power from a very different kind of heat, the intense, transformative fire of the forge. Now let's step away from the sun-drenched fields and into the fiery, transformative heart of the ancient community, the blacksmith's forge. If the sickle was a symbol of reaping what one sows, then the blacksmith's hammer was the very instrument of sowing change itself. In a world built on wood, stone, and bronze, the blacksmith was a figure of almost mystical power. He alone could command fire, wrestle metal from stubborn ore, and with rhythmic, ringing blows, shape that raw material into something entirely new. This unique position made the smithy far more than a workshop. It was a place of creation, innovation, and when the need arose, a secret arsenal for rebellion. The hammer and anvil, therefore, became one of the most potent dual symbols of ancient resistance, representing both the literal forging of weapons and the metaphorical shaping of a new destiny. During times of open unrest, the blacksmith's role became critically ambiguous. He was often conscripted by ruling powers to produce swords, spearheads, and armor for the very armies enforcing oppression. Yet, in the dead of night, that same hammer could fall upon the anvil for a very different purpose. There are countless unrecorded moments in history where a smith, sympathetic to a local cause, would use his skills to secretly craft blades for rebels or repair their damaged equipment. The act was incredibly dangerous. The sound of the hammer was public, and the demand for metal was closely monitored. But this duality is what gave the hammer its profound symbolic weight. It was a tool that served the master by day and the liberator by night, a perfect metaphor for the subversive potential hidden within the very structures of power. The hammer wasn't just banging on metal, it was tapping out a coded rhythm of defiance, a signal that even the tools of control could be repurposed for freedom. This symbolism extended far beyond the practical into the deeply spiritual, particularly among the Celtic and Germanic tribes who fiercely resisted the expansion of the Roman Empire. For these cultures, the blacksmith was often linked to the divine. The most powerful example is found in the Norse god Thor and his legendary hammer, Mjolnir. More than just a weapon of destruction, Mjolnir was a multifaceted symbol of protection, consecration, and strength. It was used to hallow marriages, bless new ventures, and guard against chaotic forces. In the face of Roman invasion, which sought to impose its own gods, laws, and social order, Thor's hammer became a powerful cultural emblem of defiance. Wearing a Mjolnir amulet wasn't merely a statement of faith. It was a quiet but firm declaration of identity, a refusal to assimilate. It said, "We are not Roman. Our strength comes from our own gods, our own traditions." The hammer here transcended its physical form to become a spiritual rallying point, a symbol of resilience that could not be easily broken by legions or laws. The very process of smithing itself provided a powerful metaphor for communities under pressure. The rhythmic, relentless strike of hammer on anvil, clang, pause, echoed the steady, determined heartbeat of a people enduring hardship. Just as the smith used heat and force to transform a shapeless lump of iron into a useful, sharp, and purposeful tool, so too did oppressed communities see themselves as being forged in the fires of adversity. The pressure they faced was not seen as something that would break them, but as something that would ultimately shape them into something stronger, sharper, and more unified. The anvil, which bears the brunt of every blow without breaking, became a perfect symbol of endurance. It represented the unyielding foundation of a culture, its traditions, its language, its shared spirit, that could withstand the hammer blows of an empire. This fusion of sheer practicality and profound symbolism is what makes the hammer and anvil such an enduring image. They remind us that the tools we use to build and create contain within them the latent potential to dismantle and rebuild. They show us that true strength lies not just in the power to strike, but in the resilience to endure the strike and emerge transformed. While the hammer and anvil roared with the fire of transformation, another form of resistance was taking shape in a much quieter, more patient space, one defined by the gentle click-clack of the loom. If the forge was the heart of the community, the weaving room was its central nervous system, a place where women, and often enslaved individuals, gathered not just to produce essential cloth, but to weave something far more powerful, the very fabric of rebellion itself. The loom, a large stationary frame, might seem like the most unlikely instrument of defiance. It was heavy, difficult to move, and its operation was a slow, meticulous process. Yet, it was this very quality of being rooted in the domestic sphere, of being utterly commonplace and therefore invisible to those in power, that made it the perfect vehicle for clandestine organization. Under the guise of performing their expected duties, oppressed groups could use the hours spent at the loom to communicate, conspire, and coordinate, turning threads of wool and flax into threads of solidarity. The most stunning examples of this come from the Andean cultures in the centuries surrounding Inca rule. The Incas, master administrators of a vast empire, often resettled conquered peoples to break up old alliances and enforce loyalty. For these displaced communities, their traditional textiles became a vital repository of identity and a secret language of resistance. Expert weavers, always women, began to encode messages directly into the intricate patterns of their fabrics. To an Inca overseer, a textile might simply display a beautiful, complex geometric design. But to a member of the community, that same pattern could be a detailed map of the local terrain, pointing out safe routes for escape or secret meeting places. Other patterns might tell the history of their people before conquest, or depict symbols of their native gods, keeping their true beliefs alive under a foreign-imposed religion. The act of weaving itself, of taking countless separate threads and patiently interlacing them into a strong, unified whole, was a powerful metaphor for their situation. It was a daily reminder that their fractured community could be woven back together, that resilience was built one careful, deliberate thread at a time. Their art was their archive, their map, and their manifesto, all hidden in plain sight. This practice was not confined to the Andes. Thousands of miles and years away, in the ancient city-states of Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered another silent testament to loom-based solidarity. They have found ceramic loom weights, the heavy objects that keep the warped threads of a vertical loom taut, etched with tiny, subtle symbols. In a society built on slavery, these weights, used primarily by enslaved women, were sometimes marked with shared signs, a particular star, a unique cross, or a simplified animal figure. These were not official marks of ownership from a master. They were personal, covert symbols of connection, exchanging a loom weight with a fellow slave, or simply knowing that another was using a similarly marked weight created an invisible bond. In a life defined by powerlessness and isolation, this was a way to assert, "I am here, you are not alone, we are connected." It was a breathtakingly simple yet profound act of defiance, using the very tool that anchored them to their forced labor to secretly anchor themselves to each other. The loom, therefore, represents a uniquely sophisticated form of resistance. It wasn't about open confrontation or the forging of weapons. It was about the patient, intelligent cultivation of a parallel world existing just beneath the surface of the official one. It was about preserving memory, identity, and hope through the application of skill and artistry. Every throw of the shuttle, every press of the weft could carry a hidden meaning, a stitch in the larger tapestry of defiance. The resulting textiles, whether a warm blanket or a noble's tunic, carried these secret stories within them, wrapping the entire society, including the oppressors, in a fabric literally woven with silent protest. It proves that power is not always asserted through loud declarations. Sometimes it is quietly, insistently woven into the very structure of everyday life, a constant, subtle reminder that even the most controlled environments can contain the seeds of liberation. And just as the loom was rooted to the earth of the home, another tool was deeply rooted in the earth itself, representing a struggle not just for community, but for the very ground beneath people's feet. If the loom wove the fabric of community resistance, the plow cut a far more fundamental and visceral line of defiance, one drawn directly in the earth itself. This simple yet revolutionary tool, essentially a pointed stick evolved into a blade that could turn the soil, was the very foundation of settled civilization. It allowed humanity to transition from nomadic hunting and gathering to farming, to put down roots in every sense of the word. And because of that, the plow became more than just a tool for growing food. It became an extension of the farmer's body, a physical claim on the land, and a sacred bond between a people and their territory. When that bond was threatened by conquest, taxation, or outright theft, the plow was naturally elevated from an implement of cultivation into a powerful symbol of rightful ownership and emancipatory struggle. We can see this profound connection vividly in ancient Judea, a land perennially caught between the empires of the ancient Near East. Under successive periods of Assyrian, Babylonian, and later Roman domination, Jewish farmers faced not only heavy tribute demands but also the constant threat of dispossession. Their ancestral lands could be confiscated and given to foreign settlers or loyal soldiers. In this pressured environment, the act of plowing took on a deeply subversive meaning. A farmer guiding his plow across a contested field was doing far more than preparing it for seed. He was physically inscribing his claim onto the landscape, each furrow a line drawn in the soil against imperial encroachment. This was a quiet, persistent form of protest, a way of asserting, "This land is mine. My family has worked it for generations. Your edicts and your taxes do not erase my connection to it." The plowshare itself, the metal tip that bit into the earth, became a symbol of this unbreakable tie. To beat a sword into a plowshare, as the famous biblical prophecy from Isaiah suggests, was to dream of a future where the tools of war would be transformed back into instruments of peaceful, life-sustaining labor, a powerful inversion that itself contains a yearning for autonomy and freedom from conflict. This symbolism was often cemented through ritual and artistry. Archaeologists have made fascinating discoveries that underscore the plow's ceremonial importance. In various parts of Europe and the Near East, ancient plowshares have been found that were never meant to touch soil. Instead, they were carefully reshaped, polished, and sometimes even inscribed with symbols or family marks. These objects appear to have been used in community ceremonies that affirmed land rights, inheritance, and tribal identity. In a world before written deeds were common, the act of presenting a ceremonial plowshare might have been a way to visually demonstrate a family's historic claim to a parcel of land, their rightful share of the earth's bounty. The plow, in this context, transcended its agricultural function to become a legal and spiritual artifact, a tangible link to the past and a guarantee for the future. Its transformation from a dirty, utilitarian blade into a polished object of reverence perfectly mirrors its journey from a simple farm tool to an icon of cultural endurance. The power of the plow as a symbol lies in its deep, almost primal resonance. It represents the most basic human right, to feed oneself and one's family from the labor of one's own hands on one's own land. Resistance rooted in this concept is incredibly potent because it speaks to survival, identity, and dignity all at once. It is a defiance that is not about conquest, but about continuity, not about gaining power over others, but about retaining power over one's own life. The furrow it creates is a boundary, a declaration of independence written not on parchment, but on the very skin of the earth. This tool reminds us that the most powerful acts of rebellion are often those that protect and preserve a way of life, ensuring that the seeds of culture and community can be sown again with each passing season. And just as the plow carved messages of belonging into the land, another everyday medium clay would become a canvas for hidden narratives of descent, fired into permanence for us to discover millennia later. Now, let's shift our gaze from the sweeping furrows of the plowed field to the intimate, handheld world of the pottery vessel. In almost every ancient home, from the most humble peasant hut to the most lavish villa, pottery was an inescapable part of daily life. It held the water, stored the grain, cooked the stew, and transported the wine. It was, in a very real sense, the container of civilization itself. And because it was so utterly common, so functionally invisible to the powers that be, it became one of the most ingenious and enduring canvases for silent rebellion. While a soldier or tax collector might scrutinize a speech or a written pamphlet, who would bother to closely examine the pattern on a common cooking pot? This perceived insignificance gave potters often among the lower echelons of artisans a unique and powerful opportunity. With a flick of the wrist and a dab of glaze, they could embed subversive messages into objects that would circulate freely, right under the noses of the authorities, carrying whispers of defiance into every household. Consider the vast, sprawling expanse of the Roman Empire. In provinces from Britannia to Syria, local potters living under the heel of Roman occupation began to incorporate incredibly subtle symbols into their traditional designs. A decorative border might suddenly feature a pattern that, to a local, clearly resembled broken chains. A scene of a pastoral idyll could include a small, almost hidden figure making a defiant gesture, a raised fist, a turned back. On the surface, these were just decorative elements, perhaps a little crude or unusual to a Roman eye, but nothing worthy of alarm. To a member of the subjugated community, however, that pot was a powerful statement. It was a reminder of a lost freedom, a nod to shared resentment, and a signal that the spirit of resistance, though forced underground, was still very much alive. The act of purchasing such a pot, of placing it proudly in one's home, became a quiet act of solidarity. Every time water was poured from it or grain was scooped from its depths, it reinforced a shared identity and a silent refusal to be completely assimilated. This practice of embedding narratives in clay stretches back even further, to the magnificent and sophisticated Minoan civilization on Crete. Unlike the later, more overt defiance under empires, Minoan art often reveals a different kind of resistance, a resistance to the very idea of centralized hierarchical power itself. Their magnificent palace complexes, like Knossos, suggest a highly organized society, but the pottery tells another story. Many Minoan ceramics are decorated not with images of mighty kings or conquering heroes, but with vibrant, dynamic scenes of communal labor. We see detailed paintings of fishermen hauling in their nets together, of harvesters working in unison in the fields, of artisans collaborating on a project. This wasn't merely recording daily life, this was promoting an ideology. In a world increasingly surrounded by monarchies and rigid social structures, these pots emphasized collective strength and communal achievement. They were a visual argument that the true power of society lay not in a single ruler, but in the coordinated effort of its people. The pottery served as a constant, beautiful reminder of a social contract built on cooperation rather than coercion. The remarkable durability of fired clay is what allows us to hear these whispers across the millennia. While papyrus rots, wood decays, and memories fade, a shattered pot can be pieced back together, its message still legible. When archaeologists carefully reassemble these vessels, they are not just reconstructing an artifact, they are opening a direct window into the minds of ancient resistors. They are deciphering a coded language of art and symbolism that was designed to be understood by the initiated and overlooked by the oppressor. This blending of artistic expression with activist intent is a testament to the human spirit's incredible creativity under pressure. It proves that endurance is not just about physical toughness. It is often about the intellectual and artistic ingenuity required to keep a culture's flame alive, to preserve its stories and its values, even when doing so openly would mean certain destruction. The humble potter sitting at their wheel became an archivist of anger, a librarian of hope, ensuring that the aspirations of the people were literally fired into a permanent record, waiting for a future generation to dig them up and understand. Now, let us cast our nets into the deep blue waters of the ancient world, where the struggle for survival and autonomy took on a uniquely fluid and interconnected form. For coastal communities from the Levant to the Aegean, the fishing net was not merely a tool, it was the very lifeline that sustained families and entire villages. Its intricate web of fibers, meticulously crafted and constantly repaired, was a daily testament to human ingenuity in harnessing the bounty of the sea. Yet, when that bounty was threatened by greedy merchant monopolies, by foreign naval powers imposing crippling taxes, or by rival groups seizing traditional fishing grounds, this humble implement of sustenance was dramatically repurposed. It became a weapon of collective defiance, a floating barrier against oppression, and a powerful symbol of a community's right to its own resources. The net, in its very design, was a perfect metaphor for the kind of resistance that flourished in these maritime cultures, flexible, strong, and reliant on the strength of countless interconnected parts. The ancient Phoenicians, renowned as master seafarers and traders, provide a brilliant case study in this aquatic form of rebellion. While their city-states like Tyre and Sidon are often remembered for their commercial empires, their working-class fishermen faced constant pressure from elite merchant princes who sought to control and tax their catches. Historical accounts and folk traditions hint at organized acts of resistance where fishermen would not simply comply. In a stunningly clever tactic, they sometimes used their massive nets not to catch fish, but to ensnare the engines of their oppression. By strategically deploying and even sacrificing their nets, they could create ad hoc blockades, fouling the propellers and rudders of the tax collectors' ships or trapping them in a web of weighted rope, rendering them immobile and impotent. This was a form of protest that required immense coordination and courage, conducted on the open water away from the eyes of soldiers on land. It was a statement that screamed, "You may control the port, but you do not control the sea or those who work it. Our nets feed the city, and we will decide how they are used." This theme of maritime defiance echoed powerfully across the Mediterranean in the world of ancient Greece. Here, the conflict was often between local, independent fishing communities and the expanding naval power of city-states like Athens, which could impose restrictions to protect the interests of its own fleet or its wealthy citizens. Greek fishermen, much like their Phoenician counterparts, understood the symbolic and practical power of their primary tool. A net, by its nature, is a collective instrument. It is too large and cumbersome for one person to handle effectively. Its use requires a crew working in perfect unison, each person understanding their role, pulling together at the precise moment to haul in the catch. This inherent need for cooperation made the net a natural emblem of unity. When these communities felt their autonomy was under threat, the act of fishing itself became politicized. The shared labor over the nets reinforced their bonds, and the potential to use those same nets to sabotage an aggressor's vessel was an ever-present, unspoken threat. They were defending not just their livelihood, but an entire way of life built on mutual dependence and shared effort. Archaeology provides us with tangible, chilling evidence of how deeply this symbolism was felt. In various underwater sites and ancient port settlements, archaeologists have recovered carved stone net weights or plummets that are far more than simple functional objects. Some are incised with symbols that clearly served as markers of identity and alliance, a specific pattern of lines, a stylized animal, or a unique sigil. In a time of tension, a fisherman could look at the weights on another boat's net and know instantly if they were friend or foe, part of the same cooperative or a potential threat. Other recovered weights bear more overtly defiant imagery, like a tiny etched fist or a broken chain. These small, heavy stones, designed to sink into the depths, actually serve to buoy up the spirits of a community. They were constant, tactile reminders of a shared commitment to resist exploitation, a promise weighted down and cast into the sea alongside their nets, waiting to be drawn back up full of purpose. The aquatic environment demanded a different kind of resistance, one that was fluid, adaptable, and deeply networked, and the fishing net, in both its form and its function, became its perfect embodiment. But while nets and plows represented physical and economic defiance, another form of resistance was taking shape in the silent, hallowed spaces where information was controlled, the scriptoriums and administrative offices of ancient empires. Here, the weapon of choice was not a blade or a net, but the humble stylus, a pointed reed or metal rod used to inscribe words onto clay or wax. In the hands of a compliant scribe, this tool was an instrument of state power, recording laws, taxes, and royal decrees that reinforced the status quo. Yet, in the hands of a courageous few, that same stylus became a remarkably subtle and potent weapon of ideological rebellion, a tool to challenge official narratives and ensure that alternative truths would not be erased by the whims of the powerful. This was a resistance fought not with force, but with the careful, deliberate scoring of symbols onto a malleable surface. Consider the immense pressure on a scribe in the vast bureaucratic machine of Assyria or Egypt. Their entire profession was built on serving the king, the priesthood, and the elite. They were the amplifiers of state propaganda, the recorders of victories that were often massacres, and the accountants documenting wealth extracted from the poor. To openly dissent was unthinkable. It meant certain death and the obliteration of one's entire family line. And yet, archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets and papyrus fragments that reveal a breathtaking audacity hidden within this compliance. A scribe might subtly alter a formulaic royal inscription, changing a standard epithet like the mighty king to something ever so slightly ambivalent, perhaps the king who is mighty, a tiny grammatical shift that could suggest irony or doubt to a literate reader. In economic records, a list of tributes paid by a conquered village might be quietly annotated with a small symbol, a tear drop, a downturned mouth, a silent, enduring protest against the human cost of that wealth. These were acts of incredible bravery, a game of cat and mouse played with the very words that structured reality, proving that even the most controlled systems contain cracks where dissent can grow. The act of writing itself in an age before instant communication was a perfect metaphor for the kind of resistance these scribes embodied. It was slow, patient, and meticulous. Each cuneiform wedge pressed into wet clay or each delicate hieroglyph carefully painted required immense focus and precision. This mirrored the long-term, strategic patience required to undermine a powerful regime. You could not overthrow an empire in a day, but you could, over years, subtly shift the record. You could ensure that a suppressed version of events, a critique of a pharaoh's greed, or the true story of a failed military campaign was preserved for future generations, buried in an archive where it might be discovered long after the ruling dynasty had turned to dust. The stylus, therefore, became a symbol of truth's endurance against the ephemeral roar of propaganda. It represented the belief that a carefully recorded idea, hidden away like a seed, could outlast the empire that tried to crush it. Some of the most compelling evidence of this comes from discoveries far outside the royal palaces, in the ruins of smaller, provincial administration buildings and even private homes. Archaeologists have found practice tablets and personal diaries that contain startling content. Among the repetitive copying of official texts, a bored or disgruntled scribe in training might have etched a piece of political satire, a joke at the expense of a widely disliked governor, or a cynical commentary on a recent royal decree. These weren't meant for public distribution, they were private venting, a way to preserve one's own sanity and critical perspective within a system demanding absolute conformity. The discovery of such tablets is incredibly revealing. It shows that the subversion wasn't always a grand, organized conspiracy. Sometimes it was the simple, human act of an individual refusing to completely internalize the official narrative, using their skill with the stylus to carve out a small mental space for free thought. This tool, then, highlights the profound power of information control. Those who wield the stylus don't just record history, they actively shape it. The legacy of these ancient scribes reminds us that knowledge, carefully preserved and transmitted, is the most durable armor against oppression, protecting not the body, but the memory and the conscience of a people. But long before a scribe could pour truth from an ink pot, another form of communication was vibrating through the air, one that required no literacy to understand yet could convey messages of stunning complexity and urgency. We move now from the silent world of written subversion to the powerful, pulsating realm of sound. In countless ancient cultures, musical instruments were far more than sources of entertainment. They were the original wireless network, the heartbeat of a community, and when the moment demanded it, the secret soundtrack to revolution. Drums and flutes, in their beautiful simplicity, became some of the most sophisticated tools of resistance ever devised, weaving defiance into the very rhythm of daily life, and using the universal language of rhythm and melody to coordinate, inspire, and unite in ways that words alone never could. Consider the drum, perhaps the most ancient instrument known to humanity. In the dense rainforests of Mesoamerica or across the vast savannas of Africa, the sound of a drum could carry for miles, cutting through the visual noise of the landscape. To an untrained ear, it might simply be the background music of a village celebration. but to the initiated, a specific, complex pattern of beats was a precise and urgent message. In pre-Columbian societies, there are accounts of drums being used to coordinate the movements of resistance groups against dominant powers like the Aztecs, their complex polyrhythms acting as a coded battle plan broadcast across great distances. The beauty of this system was its deniability. An occupying force might hear the drums and sense a gathering, but without the cultural key to decipher the code, they would be powerless to stop the message from spreading. The drum became the voice of the community itself, a collective heartbeat that could quicken to signal danger or fall into a steady, reassuring rhythm to bolster morale on the eve of a confrontation. It was a technology of unity that was completely immune to confiscation or censorship. The flute, often seen as a more solitary and pastoral instrument, played an equally vital but more intimate role in the psychology of resistance. In cultures facing the crushing pressure of assimilation, such as many indigenous groups under the thumb of an expanding empire, the flute was a keeper of identity. Its melodies were often tied to specific rituals, myths, and stories that defined a people. By continuing to play these ancient airs, especially in secret or in defiance of bans, communities performed a powerful act of cultural preservation. Each note was a refusal to forget, a breath of continuity against the wind of change that sought to erase them. In the highlands of the Andes or among nomadic tribes of the Sahara, the sound of a traditional flute at dusk was not merely a tune, it was an affirmation. It whispered, "We are still here, our stories still have breath, our ancestors still listen." This auditory resistance fortified the spirit, providing the emotional strength needed to endure physical and political pressures. It embedded a sense of unbroken tradition into the very air people breathed, making cultural annihilation impossible as long as a single musician could still play. This fusion of art and practicality is what makes the story of musical resistance so compelling. These instruments demonstrate that the struggle for freedom is not waged with weapons alone, but also with culture, with spirit, and with shared emotion. The drum coordinated the body of the resistance, while the flute fortified its soul. Together, they created a harmony of action and feeling, proving that effective defiance must engage both the strategic mind and the human heart. They turned performance into a practical tool, ensuring that the rhythm of rebellion was not just heard, but felt in the bones of everyone involved, creating an unbreakable bond of shared purpose that was as powerful as any physical barrier. This auditory layer adds a profound depth to our understanding of how ancient people fought back, using the intangible medium of sound to build the most tangible force of all, unshakable unity. Now let's shift from the rhythmic pulse of music to a much smaller, sharper sound, the precise puncture of an all-piercing tough leather. In the workshops of ancient leatherworkers, this was the sound of craft, of creating everything from durable sandals for Roman legionaries to sturdy saddles for nomadic horsemen. The awl itself was a humble yet vital tool, a sharp, pointed spike set in a handle, used to pierce holes so that sinew or thread could be passed through to stitch hides together. It was a tool of assembly and repair, utterly dedicated to its specific practical function. But in the hands of those living under the watchful eye of an occupying power, this same tool of construction was subtly transformed into an instrument of quiet subversion, its sharp point becoming a needle writing a secret language of defiance onto the very materials it was meant to assemble. We find a powerful example of this among the Celtic tribes of Gaul and Britain as they faced the relentless expansion of the Roman Empire. The Roman military machine was not just a force of soldiers, it was a system of cultural assimilation, demanding conformity and loyalty. For Celtic artisans, particularly leather workers who supplied goods to both their own people and sometimes even to the Romans, this created a tense and dangerous environment. How could one maintain a sense of identity and resistance while seemingly complying with the demands of the conqueror? The All provided an ingenious answer. These skilled craftsmen began to use their fine-pointed tools to etch tiny, almost invisible symbols into the leather of the goods they produced. A Roman cavalryman might never notice the protective rune or the symbol of a local earth goddess carefully scored into the inside of his horse's bridle. A Roman official might wear a new leather satchel, completely unaware that its flap concealed a tiny mark designating the craftsman's tribal allegiance. These were not grand gestures, but they were profoundly meaningful. Each tiny puncture was a reclamation of identity, a way of whispering a prayer for protection or a statement of solidarity into an object that was now part of the oppressive system itself. The warrior riding into battle to subjugate them was ironically carrying a secret charm against his own success, placed there by the very hands that made his gear. The effectiveness of the awl for this purpose lay in its perfect combination of precision and deniability. The marks it made could be so small and placed in such an inconspicuous location that they escaped all but the most meticulous inspection. This allowed for breathtakingly bold acts of defiance that were hiding in plain sight. A leather worker conscripted to repair the equipment of a local Roman garrison could use his awl to subtly alter official insignias, perhaps changing a detail ever so slightly to mock the authority it represented. More practically, these tiny punctures could also serve as a code. A specific pattern of dots or a small, all-etched symbol on a leather water carrier could identify its owner as a friendly agent or signal that a piece of luggage contained a hidden compartment for carrying messages or contraband. The awl, therefore, became a key tool in building the clandestine networks that were essential for organized resistance, creating a silent, tactile language that only those in the know could read. This transformation of the awl from a simple hole puncher to an instrument of covert communication is a masterclass in the ingenuity of the oppressed. It exemplifies a central truth about this kind of resistance. It often flourishes in the minute details, in the spaces between the stitches where the powerful are not looking. The grand spectacle of open revolt was often suicide. Survival and sustained opposition required this kind of subtle, intelligent action. The leatherworkers all reminds us that you don't always need a sword to fight an empire. Sometimes the most effective weapon is a dedicated craftsperson's tool, wielded with patience, skill, and immense courage, leaving a legacy of defiance not in shouted slogans, but in silent, carefully placed punctures on the inside of a leather hide. And just as the awl's precise point made its mark on materials, another, much larger and heavier tool would make its mark through sheer, relentless grinding force. Now let's move from the sharp, precise puncture of the awl to something far larger, heavier, and more foundational, the immense grinding weight of the millstone. In the ancient world, the mill was the absolute heart of a community's sustenance. It was here, between two massive, circular stones, that hard-won grain was transformed into the flour that meant the difference between life and starvation. The rhythmic, circular grind of the millstone was the sound of survival itself, a constant, reassuring hum that signaled the community was being fed. But this very necessity made the mill and its stones a point of extreme vulnerability and therefore a powerful lever for protest. When systems of power, be they greedy landlords, corrupt officials, or invading armies, threatened that lifeline by seizing control of mills, imposing crippling taxes on flour, or hoarding grain during famines, the millstone was transformed. It ceased to be just a tool for grinding grain and became a monumental symbol of economic justice, and a potential weapon for grinding down the mechanisms of oppression itself. Imagine the scene in a small village under the Roman Empire during a time of famine. The imperial tax collectors, or publicani, demand their share of the harvest, leaving families with barely enough grain to survive the winter. Then, the local landowner who owns the mill announces a new fee for its use, taking a portion of the already meager flour as payment. The community is caught in a vicious, inescapable trap. Work the land to feed the empire and the elite, only to starve yourself. It is at this breaking point that the mill becomes a natural gathering place for anger and organization. Rather than a solitary chore, grinding grain becomes a collective act of defiance. Villagers might gather at the mill not to work, but to stand in silent, unmoving protest, physically blocking its operation. This was a stunningly effective tactic. By halting the mill, they halted the entire local economy of food. They were making it visually, undeniably clear. We are the ones who grow the grain and grind the flour. Without our labor, this system collapses. Our hunger will now be your hunger. This resistance could take even more direct and desperate forms. There are historical accounts and folk memories from across the ancient world, from the Celtic tribes of Europe to rural communities in Anatolia, of millstones being deliberately damaged. A critical piece of the grinding mechanism might be hidden, or a stone itself cracked with a well-aimed blow from a hammer. This was a radical act of sabotage, a deliberate wound inflicted on the very infrastructure of their own daily lives. But it was a calculated sacrifice. The short-term pain of being without a mill was deemed worth the long-term gain of disrupting an oppressive system that was slowly killing them. It was a way of saying, if this system will not feed us fairly, then it will not feed anyone. The immense weight of the millstone, which usually represented stable, enduring routine, now represented the heavy burden of injustice, and the act of damaging it was a dramatic attempt to shatter that burden. The millstone's very design lent itself to powerful symbolism. Its endless, circular motion came to mirror the cyclical nature of the struggle itself, seasons of planting and harvest, but also seasons of hardship and resilience. Each rotation could be seen as reinforcing the collective determination of the people, grinding away slowly but surely at the foundations of their oppression. Archaeologists have found fascinating evidence that communities actively reinforced this symbolism. In several European archaeological sites, fragments of millstones have been discovered that bear deliberate engravings. These aren't accidental scratches from use. They are carefully carved symbols of unity, interlocking circles, shared clan marks, or even short words like strength or together in local dialects. These stones were literally inscribed with the ideology of resistance. Touching that symbol while feeding grain into the mill became a daily ritual, a tactile reminder of a shared commitment to persevere and fight for a fair share of what they themselves produced. The millstone, therefore, stands as a profound example of how the most critical infrastructure for survival can become the most potent stage for dissent, proving that the power to feed a community is ultimately the power to control its destiny. While the millstone's immense weight represented a collective grinding down of oppression, another tool took a more precise and incisive approach to dissent. The carpenter's saw, with its sharp, serrated teeth designed to bite into timber, was fundamentally a tool of division and creation. It could take a rough, whole log and transform it into planks, beams, and intricate components for building everything from humble homes to royal palaces. This very act of transformation, of dividing to create, made the saw a powerful and versatile metaphor in the hands of ancient artisans who found themselves at odds with the systems they served. In societies with strong central control, like ancient China during the Qin and Han dynasties, the state often exerted immense pressure on skilled craftsmen. Artisans' guilds were expected to produce vast quantities of standardized goods for grand imperial projects, from building palaces to crafting official chariots, often under strict deadlines and for meager compensation that barely acknowledged their expertise. It was within this pressurized environment that the saw, the emblem of their trade, was elevated from a simple workshop tool into a potent symbol of their rights and an instrument for carving out a measure of autonomy. These artisan guilds, often tight-knit communities bound by shared skills and secret knowledge, developed intricate rituals to affirm their identity and solidarity, and the saw frequently played a central role. In initiation ceremonies or clandestine meetings, a master carpenter might present a ceremonial saw to a new apprentice. This wasn't just a practical gift, it was a loaded symbol. The act of passing on the tool came with whispered lessons about the true value of their labor and the importance of standing together to demand fair treatment. The saw's function made it a perfect teaching device. Just as it could cut a straight, true line through knotted wood, so too should a craftsman cut through the deception and corruption of a dishonest official or a greedy contractor. Its ability to refine rough material into something useful and beautiful served as a metaphor for their own role in society. They were the ones who built the very infrastructure of civilization, and they deserved to be treated with the respect owed to such vital contributors, not as disposable cogs in a state machine. This symbolic power occasionally left a tangible mark on history. Archaeologists have unearthed ancient saw blades, particularly from sites in East Asia and the Roman world, that bear more than just the marks of hard use. Some have been found with inscriptions carefully etched into the metal near the handle, far from the cutting edge where they would be worn away. These are not owner's marks or simple decorations. Faint but legible phrases like "a fair day's wage" or "the hand that builds deserves to eat" have been found, a direct and daring statement of labor advocacy from millennia ago. Imagine the courage it took for a carpenter to use his own tools to inscribe such a sentiment, knowing discovery could bring severe punishment. This saw blade was no longer just a piece of workshop equipment. It was a hidden manifesto, a piece of protest art that could be passed from hand to hand, its message felt with every grip. It turned the act of sawing into a silent, repetitive declaration of the worker's worth. The saw's story beautifully illustrates a crucial link that often goes unnoticed: the connection between high-quality craftsmanship and a deeply ingrained sense of civic conscience. A skilled carpenter doesn't just see a piece of wood, he sees its potential grain, its strengths, its weaknesses, and the precise cuts needed to make it part of a sturdy, lasting structure. This mindset of careful, honest work and integrity naturally extends to a desire for a society that is also well-built and just. To see shoddy materials forced upon a project or to be cheated of a promised payment wasn't just a personal insult, it was a violation of the craftsman's entire ethical code. Wielding a saw in protest, whether literally in a dispute or symbolically in a guild ritual, was an act of applying that same precision and integrity to the social order. It was an attempt to cut away the rotten, corrupt parts of the system in hopes of building something new and better from the sound timber that remained. This fusion of skilled labor and moral conviction proves that the workshop could be as much a school for civic virtue as the forum or the academy, and the tools of the trade could become the instruments of a more profound social vision. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most humble and yet most versatile objects of the ancient world, the basket. Woven from reeds, grasses, or willow branches, baskets were the reusable shopping bags and storage containers of their day, present in every home, market, and workshop. They carried the harvest from the field, the bread from the oven, and the fish from the sea. They were so ordinary, so completely woven into the fabric of daily routine, that they became practically invisible to those in power. And it was this very quality of utter mundanity that made them the perfect vehicle for clandestine operations. In the hands of those resisting occupation, a simple basket could be transformed from a container of goods into a container of secrets, a cleverly disguised tool for building the covert networks that were the lifeblood of organized dissent. We can see this with striking clarity in Judea during the 1st century, a period of intense and often brutal Roman occupation. The Roman military, expert in conventional warfare, established checkpoints and conducted searches to control the population and quash any signs of rebellion. For Jewish resistance groups, moving supplies, weapons, or messages through these security cordons was a matter of life and death. The basket provided a brilliantly simple solution. A woman walking to market might carry a basket laden with fresh figs or loaves of bread on her head. To a Roman soldier, she was just another peasant going about her business. But nestled deep within that innocent bounty, hidden beneath a false layer of produce, could be a carefully wrapped dagger, a pouch of silver coins to fund the resistance, or a small scroll containing vital intelligence. The very act of carrying a basket was a form of camouflage, a performance of normalcy that allowed dangerous contraband to slip through the tightest net. This was espionage that relied not on advanced technology, but on a deep understanding of human psychology and the art of blending in. The design of the basket itself was a perfect metaphor for the kind of resistance it facilitated. Weaving a basket is a patient, skillful process of taking individual, fragile strands and interlacing them into a strong, resilient, and interconnected whole. This directly mirrored the painstaking work of building an underground network. Each person in the resistance was like a single reed, vulnerable on their own, but when woven together through trust, shared purpose, and secret communication, they created a structure that could carry an immense weight and withstand significant pressure. The basket's strength came from the collective interdependence of its parts, and so did the strength of the rebellion. This symbolic resonance was not lost on those involved. The act of passing a basket from one person to another could itself be a ritual of solidarity, a tangible representation of the trust being placed in another member of the cell. Some archaeological finds suggest this symbolism was made explicit. In various regions under Roman rule, including Judea and parts of Celtic Europe, baskets have been discovered with unusual patterns woven into their design. To the casual observer, they might look like simple decorative motifs, but to the initiated, these patterns could serve as crucial identifiers. A specific chevron design near the handle might indicate that the carrier was a friendly agent and that the basket contained a hidden message. A particular spiral pattern could secretly point the way to a safe house or a hidden meeting place. These baskets were more than just containers. They were coded maps and identification badges, their language written not in ink, but in the very twists and weaves of their construction. They turned an everyday chore into a sophisticated act of conspiracy, proving that the most effective tools of rebellion are often those that no one thinks to suspect. The ordinary basket, therefore, stands as a powerful testament to the fact that resistance is not always loud and confrontational. Sometimes it is quietly woven, strand by strand, in the most unexpected of places. While the carpenter's saw represented a precise, incisive form of protest, another tool embodied a completely different philosophy of resistance, one rooted not in division, but in gentle guidance and communal protection. High in the rugged highlands or out on the vast, windswept steppes, the shepherd's crook was far more than a simple stick. Its distinctively curved end was meticulously designed to do one thing with exquisite care: gently hook around the neck of a straying sheep and guide it back to the safety of the flock without causing any harm. This was not a tool of force but of stewardship. It represented a profound responsibility for the well-being of every member of the community, and it was this very ethos that made it such a powerful and unexpected emblem of rebellion among ancient pastoral peoples. When their way of life was threatened, the crook was transformed from an instrument of animal husbandry into a standard of leadership and a symbol of a resistance that was as much about protecting what they had as it was about fighting for what they wanted. For nomadic cultures like the ancient Bedouin of the Arabian Peninsula, life was defined by movement and the constant search for precious grazing land. Their entire social structure and survival were built around the health of their flocks. Disputes over water rights and pasture were not mere arguments. They were existential conflicts that could determine whether a community would thrive or perish. In these tense negotiations and occasional standoffs, the shepherd's crook took on a powerful ceremonial role. A tribal leader would not necessarily brandish a sword to assert his people's claim to a territory. Instead, he might hold his crook aloft. This was a multi-layered symbol. Its very presence spoke of their pastoral identity and their legitimate need for the resources they were claiming. The curved hook, which could gently restrain, also represented the leader's authority to guide and unify his people during a crisis. Raising the crook was a call to collective action, but it was an action framed by the values of the community, a firm defense of their rights, but ideally without the need for bloody confrontation. It was a symbol that prioritized the welfare of the whole over the glory of individual combat. This idea of protective resistance is beautifully captured in the physical artifacts these shepherds left behind. Archaeologists have discovered remarkably well-preserved, ornate crooks in burial sites and ancient settlements across the Middle East and North Africa. These are not the rough, utilitarian tools used for daily work, but objects of great significance, often crafted from precious woods and inlaid with bone or silver. What's most revealing are the symbols carved into them. Some bear intricate patterns that map ancestral migration routes, a permanent record of a people's historic connection to the land. Others are etched with clan symbols or protective sigils, transforming the crook into a talisman for the entire community's safety. One particularly compelling find is a crook with a series of notches carved into its shaft, believed to represent the number of times the community had successfully defended its grazing grounds through negotiation or peaceful demonstration. These artifacts prove that the crook was a repository of cultural memory, a physical object that encoded a history of resilience and a continuous claim to a way of life. It was a reminder that their identity was not bound by fixed walls or cities, but was carried with them quite literally in their hands. The enduring power of the shepherd's crook lies in its unique symbolism. It challenges our modern, often narrow, definition of resistance as necessarily being violent or aggressively confrontational. Here was a tool that represented a philosophy of measured, compassionate, yet unyielding defiance. It stood for the protection of the vulnerable, the guidance of the community, and the defense of a sustainable way of life. The crook's message was clear. True strength is not proven by how effectively you can destroy an enemy, but by how skillfully you can safeguard and guide your own people through times of immense danger. It reminds us that some of the most powerful rebellions are those fought not for conquest, but for preservation, and that the tools we associate with care and nurture can, when necessary, become the very emblems of unwavering resolve. Now consider the quiet, intimate glow of an oil lamp in the ancient world, a small, flickering sphere of light pushing back against an immense darkness. In an era before electricity, this humble vessel of clay or bronze was not merely a convenience. It was a fundamental barrier between safety and danger, between community and isolation, between the known and the terrifying unknown. Its warm, steady flame allowed families to gather, artisans to work past sunset, and scholars to study. But when darkness fell not just from the night sky, but from the heavy hand of oppression, this essential source of illumination was transformed. The simple, life-giving act of lighting a lamp could become a breathtakingly courageous and coordinated act of silent rebellion, its flame a beacon of collective defiance that no authority could easily snuff out. One of the most powerful examples of this luminous resistance was the deliberate defiance of curfews imposed by occupying forces. Across the ancient world, from Roman-occupied Gaul to regions under the control of foreign dynasties, a common tactic of control was to mandate that all lights be extinguished after a certain hour. This was about more than saving oil. It was a psychological weapon designed to fracture community, stifle communication, and make people feel isolated and afraid in the dark. In response, communities would sometimes organize silent, coordinated protests. On a prearranged night, in direct violation of the decree, people would simultaneously light their lamps and place them in their windows or doorways. Imagine the powerful visual message this sent from a hillside village, dozens or even hundreds of pinpricks of light suddenly piercing the enforced blackness. This was not a riot, it was a quiet, stunningly eloquent statement. It declared, "You may own the day, but you do not own the night. You may try to isolate us, but we are still here, and we are connected by this light." The act required no shouting, no violence, just the simple, terrifying courage of striking a spark. It was a protest that was incredibly difficult for authorities to punish, for how could they arrest an entire town for the crime of needing light? The lamp's flame became a silent, shining symbol of unity and an unwavering refusal to be cowed. This symbolism was masterfully woven into the very fabric of culture and religion in places like ancient India, particularly during periods of foreign rule. The festival of Diwali, the grand festival of lights, has ancient roots that extend far beyond its current religious significance. Historians suggest that in certain eras, the mass lighting of lamps, diyas, and lanterns during Duality served as a powerful, coded celebration of autonomy and the resilience of indigenous culture against outside domination. The central narrative of the festival, the triumph of light over darkness and of good over evil, resonated on a deeply political level. To light a lamp was to participate in a shared cosmic struggle against the darkness of unjust rule. The lamp's flame, which could be passed from one wick to another to ignite countless others without ever diminishing the original source, became a perfect metaphor for how the spirit of resistance could spread, quietly, contagiously, and with an endless capacity to regenerate. A king could command an army, but he could not easily forbid a religious festival. Thus, the lamp allowed for a magnificent act of collective defiance disguised as pious tradition, illuminating a path to cultural preservation. Archaeology provides us with tangible evidence of the lamp's role in these covert activities. In excavations across the former territories of the Roman Empire and into the Middle East, archaeologists have unearthed common terracotta oil lamps that bear unusual and telling modifications. Some have been discovered with small, discrete symbols scratched into their bases: a star, a particular animal, a rune marks that would be invisible when the lamp was sitting on a table, but would be clearly felt by the hand that filled it with oil. These are believed to be identifying marks, a way for members of a resistance cell or a persecuted community to recognize one another. A seemingly casual offer to refill a neighbor's lamp could be a way to check for this secret symbol and confirm a safe connection. Other lamps have been found with their nozzles deliberately altered or with extra holes, not for better light, but likely to allow them to be used as crude signaling devices. By partially covering the lamp and uncovering it in a specific pattern, a person could send a simple pulse of light across a distance, a silent, ancient Morse code warning of danger or signaling that the coast was clear. These small clay objects were not just sources of light, they were sophisticated tools in a hidden communication network, their gentle glow carrying messages that their designers could never have imagined. Now let's descend from the sunlit world of shepherds and into the dark, dust-choked world of the quarry, where another tool was striking a very different kind of blow for freedom. Imagine the sheer, back-breaking labor of the ancient quarryman. Under a relentless sun, he would swing his heavy pick, its sharp, pointed iron head driving into the face of the limestone or granite cliff. Each shuddering impact was a battle of human will against unyielding stone, all to extract the blocks that would build the glory of pharaohs and emperors. The pick was the quintessential tool of extraction, a symbol of immense effort channeled into the service of power. Yet, in the hands of the workers who felt the sting of that power most sharply, this very instrument of their subjugation became a surprisingly effective tool for carving out small, hard-won victories and asserting their own humanity. We have remarkable evidence of this from the very heart of ancient Egypt's monument-building machine. During the reign of the great pharaohs like Ramesses II, the scale of construction was staggering, and the demand for perfect, identical stone blocks was immense. The work was brutally hard, and conditions for the laborers, a mix of conscripted workers, skilled artisans, and some slaves, were often dire, with rations sometimes delayed and oversight harsh. It was in this pressurized environment that the quarryman's pick became an instrument of subtle but brilliant sabotage. A worker swinging his pick to split a block along a natural fissure might give it one precise, extra tap in a critical spot. To an overseer, it looked like the normal course of work, but that tiny, intentional flaw hidden deep within the stone would only reveal itself miles away at the construction site. The block might crack during final shaping, or it might be slightly off dimension, forcing the builders to discard it and wasting weeks of transportation effort. This was a silent, anonymous strike against the system, a way to slow the inexorable march of progress just enough to register protest. Even more daringly, skilled stone carvers working on royal inscriptions would sometimes use their fine pointed picks to make minuscule, deliberate errors in the hieroglyphs. They might alter a symbol ever so slightly to change its meaning to something ambivalent or even mildly insulting, a secret joke etched in stone for eternity, hidden within the pharaoh's own boastful narrative. The profound irony of this resistance is what gives the quarryman's pick such symbolic weight. This was the very tool used to create the most enduring symbols of absolute power: the obelisks, the temple walls, the colossal statues that were designed to proclaim the ruler's divine authority for all time. And yet, in the hands of the anonymous workers, it became a tool to subtly critique and undermine that same power from within. The pick embodied the fundamental tension between labor and authority. The mighty could command the construction of monuments, but they were utterly dependent on the countless, nameless individuals whose skill and sweat actually brought them into being. Each swing of the pick was a reminder that the edifice of power was built on a foundation of human labor, and that foundation could develop cracks. This wasn't just individual mischief. It was often a coordinated effort. Archaeologists working in the quarries of Egypt and elsewhere have discovered picks and other stoneworking tools that bear small, discrete marks. These aren't the official marks of state ownership, but rather symbols scratched into the metal or wooden haft, interlocking circles, a particular pattern of dots, a simplified animal figure. These are believed to be marks of solidarity, akin to a union logo carved into a modern tool. They signified that the worker belonged to a particular crew or guild that looked out for one another, perhaps coordinating these slowdowns or acts of sabotage and ensuring that no one member shouldered all the risk. A marked pick was a statement that the worker's allegiance was not only to the pharaoh who commanded him, but also to his comrades who sustained him. It turned a solitary act of labor into a potential act of collective defiance. The quarryman's pick, therefore, teaches us a powerful lesson that even the most oppressive systems are not monoliths. They are riddled with small, hidden spaces where resistance can take root, and the tools of construction can, with careful, deliberate strikes, also become the tools of deconstruction, chipping away at the foundations of injustice one small, intentional flaw at a time. After the rhythmic, percussive strikes of the quarryman's pick, we find ourselves in a space filled with a very different yet equally potent aroma, the rich, earthy scent of fermentation. In the ancient world, the brewer's vat was far more than just a container for making beer or ale. It was the social and symbolic heart of a community's informal life. This large vessel, where grains steeped and transformed into a mildly intoxicating beverage, represented something truly magical to people who had few comforts, the power of transformation itself. And it was within the warm, bustling atmosphere of the tavern or the communal brewery, gathered around these vats, that some of the most potent plans for resistance were quietly fermented alongside the beer, proving that the bonds of fellowship could be just as strong as any political alliance. Across vastly different cultures, from the sun-baked river valleys of Mesopotamia to the misty hill forts of Celtic Europe, a striking pattern emerges. The places where beer was brewed and consumed became crucial, yet surprisingly overlooked, centers of free speech and grassroots organization. In Mesopotamia, the tavern was a common feature of city life, but it was often viewed with deep suspicion by the ruling elites and temple authorities. Cuneiform tablets record laws aimed at controlling these establishments, precisely because they were known as places where common people, craftsmen, laborers, farmers, could gather away from the watchful eyes of priests and officials. Here, over shared jars of beer, grievances could be aired freely. A farmer struggling under the weight of temple taxes could find a sympathetic ear from a potter facing similar pressures. This casual, convivial exchange of complaints was the first vital stage of organizing. It was the process of discovering that your individual problem was, in fact, a collective one. The vat that supplied the drink was the silent, bubbling centerpiece of this awakening. For the Celtic tribes of Europe, the communal feast centered around a great vat of ale was a cornerstone of social and political life. Chieftains were expected to be generous with their drink, as their power and prestige were directly tied to their ability to provide for their people. However, this same tradition could be turned against them. If a leader was seen as unjust, greedy, or weak, the discussions that began around the brewing vat could evolve into plans to withdraw support or even choose a new champion. The act of drinking together was a ritual that created a powerful sense of equality and shared purpose. Within the circle of drinkers, hierarchies temporarily melted away, allowing for more honest and daring conversations. The brewing vat itself, a massive wooden or ceramic vessel, served as a perfect metaphor for this process. Just as individual grains of barley were transformed through a collective, chemical process into something entirely new and more powerful, so too were individual discontents blended and transformed around it into a unified plan for action. The role of the vat extended beyond the metaphorical into the intensely practical. Historical accounts and folk tales from various cultures hint at these vessels being used for more than just brewing. During times of impending conflict or crackdowns, a brewer sympathetic to a rebel cause might use his empty or partially filled vat as a perfect hiding place. The large size and deep interior made it ideal for concealing weapons, precious supplies of grain, or even sealed messages that needed to be passed along a covert network. A soldier conducting a raid on a tavern would see a room full of drunken peasants and large, smelly vats of beer. He was unlikely to order the tedious and messy job of draining and searching each one. This allowed the brewery to function as a secure safe house and storage depot, its very mundanity providing the best possible camouflage. The vat, therefore, was not just a passive symbol but an active tool, its hollow interior offering literal shelter for the instruments of descent. This blending of social enjoyment with serious purpose is what makes the brewer's vat such a uniquely human symbol of resistance. It reminds us that the fight for freedom is not always born in grim, secretive war rooms. Sometimes it is nurtured in places of community, conversation, and even celebration. The vat represented the idea that change could be a collective project, that a better future could be built not only on courage and anger, but also on the bonds of fellowship and shared experience. It was a testament to the fact that the spirit of rebellion could be fermented anywhere people felt free to speak their minds and share their dreams, especially over a common cup. Now let us venture into one of the most perilous and claustrophobic environments of the ancient world, the deep, airless tunnels of the mine. Here, in a realm of perpetual darkness and dust-choked air, the miner's lamp was not a mere convenience. It was the absolute thin line between life and a terrifying, lonely death. Its small, flickering flame was a miner's sun and moon, his only companion in the abyss, illuminating the ore-bearing rock face and warning of the deadly, invisible choke of bad air. But for these communities who endured some of the most brutal exploitation known to antiquity, this fragile source of light took on a second, equally vital function. It became a beacon of solidarity, a clandestine signal, and a powerful symbol that even in the deepest darkness, the flame of resistance could not be extinguished. The silver mines of Laurion in ancient Athens provide a stark and powerful example. This was the engine room of the Athenian democracy, the source of the silver that funded its mighty navy and its glorious building projects. But this prosperity was built on the backs of a workforce living in hellish conditions. Thousands of slaves and condemned criminals spent their short, brutal lives underground, working long hours in narrow, unstable tunnels, their lungs filling with fine, toxic dust. They were disposable assets in the eyes of the state, driven by the whips of overseers. In this environment of absolute control and despair, communication was everything, and the lamp provided an ingenious solution. A miner could not shout a warning to a comrade in a distant tunnel without alerting the guards, but he could control his light by cupping his hand over his clay oil lamp to shutter it in a specific pattern. 3 quick flashes followed by a long pause, he could send a silent signal. This might warn of an approaching overseer, giving others a moment to stop resting and look busy. Or more daringly, it could be used to coordinate a work slowdown, a silent strike where everyone would simultaneously put down their tools, grinding the entire operation to a halt without a single word being spoken. This was resistance conducted in a terrifying silence, its language written in pulses of light against an overwhelming blackness. The lamp's flame itself became a profound metaphor for their existence. In the oppressive, all-consuming darkness of the mine, that tiny, vulnerable flame was an undeniable assertion of presence and hope. It was a literal and metaphorical statement. I am here. We are here. Its fragility mirrored their own. A strong gust of bad air or a misstep could snuff it out in an instant. Yet its persistence was a testament to their endurance. Just as the flame required constant care, the right amount of oil, a carefully trimmed wick, so too did their spirit require constant nurturing through these small, secret acts of mutual aid and defiance. The act of sharing oil from one lamp to another to help a comrade whose light had failed was more than just practical. It was a sacred ritual of solidarity. It meant my survival is tied to yours, my light is your light. This transformed the lamp from a simple tool into a powerful communal emblem, representing their shared struggle and their unwavering will to persevere together. Archaeological evidence from mining sites across the ancient world, from Lorient to Roman copper mines in Spain, confirms that these lamps were more than just anonymous, mass-produced tools. Many have been found with unique, personal markings etched into their clay bodies. Some bear what appear to be ownership marks, but others display more enigmatic symbols, a series of lines, a unique cross, a tiny animal figure. These are believed to be markers of affiliation. In a workforce often drawn from different regions and ethnic groups, these markings could identify a miner as part of a particular crew or faction, a way of building smaller circles of trust within the larger mass of suffering. A miner seeing a lamp with a familiar symbol etched on it in a new tunnel would know he was in the presence of a potential ally. Furthermore, some lamps have been discovered with small, deliberate holes punched in unusual places, not for ventilation, but likely to modify the light pattern they emitted, turning them into more sophisticated signaling devices for those who knew the code. These small, soot-blackened artifacts are silent witnesses to a sophisticated culture of resistance that flourished in the most inhuman conditions imaginable, proving that the need for community and the desire for dignity can burn even in the deepest pits of despair. Now let's step into the warm, flour-dusted world of the ancient bakery, where the scent of baking bread was the very aroma of life itself. In this bustling space, the baker's peel was an extension of the baker's own arm. A long, flat wooden shovel with a handle, expertly used to slide loaves deep into the searing heat of the stone oven and to retrieve them perfectly golden and steaming without getting burned. This tool was the final, crucial link in the chain that turned grain into sustenance, and it was handled with the reverence such a vital role deserved. But when the system that grew the grain and baked the bread failed the people it was meant to feed, this humble implement was violently transformed. The peel was no longer just a tool for serving bread. It became a weapon for demanding it, a stark emblem of the social contract shattered by greed and hunger. The most volatile flashpoints for this transformation were the bread riots that periodically erupted across the ancient world, from the sprawling metropolis of Rome to the crowded cities of the Hellenistic kingdoms. These were not random acts of chaos. They were desperate, targeted explosions of fury with a clear and simple demand: bread. The price and availability of grain were tightly controlled by the state, and when corrupt officials hoarded supplies to drive up prices, or when incompetent distribution systems failed during a famine, the baker's shop became the epicenter of rage. The baker himself was often caught in an impossible position, a middleman between an angry populace and a distant, uncaring authority. But some bakers made a choice. Historical accounts describe bakers who, in defiance of orders, used their peels not to retrieve loaves for paying customers, but to scoop up bread from their ovens and fling it into the crowds gathered outside their doors. This was a breathtaking act of solidarity and redistribution. That wooden peel, in that moment, became a lever for justice, physically transferring the means of survival from those who were withholding it to those who were dying for it. In more intense uprisings, the peel's role became even more direct and visceral. When a protest swelled into a full-scale urban revolt, the bakery was a natural target, and the tools inside became readily available arms. A baker's peel, while no sword, was a formidable instrument in a street fight. Its long handle provided reach, and its broad, flat blade could be used as a shield to deflect blows or as a club to strike them. But its power was far more symbolic than physical. To see a group of rioters brandishing these implements, still dusted with flour, was a powerful piece of political theater. They were not professional soldiers, they were bakers, laborers, and mothers, armed with the very symbols of their hunger and their labor. They were proclaiming, "We are the ones who make the bread, and we are the ones you are starving." This tool that feeds the city will now force it to be just. The peel became a makeshift banner for a movement fighting for the most basic human right, the right to eat. This profound connection to nourishment is what gave the baker's peel its unique symbolic weight. Unlike a sword crafted for killing or a hammer made for building, the peel had a single, sacred purpose: to handle food. Its entire identity was tied to life, community, and care. To wield it as an instrument of protest was to highlight the profound moral failure of the authorities. It screamed that the situation had become so desperate that the very tools of creation had to be repurposed for conflict. The peel's story is a stark reminder that throughout history, the fight for equity often crystallizes around the most fundamental elements of survival. When people are denied bread, they will eventually use the baker's peel to demand it, turning a simple kitchen tool into one of history's most powerful arguments for justice and human dignity. But the most profound power of the dyer's craft lay in its unique ability to weaponize beauty. A royal decree could outlaw a weapon or ban a gathering, but it was far more difficult to outlaw a color. How does a ruling power prosecute someone for wearing the wrong shade of blue or a particularly vibrant red? This ambiguity gave dyers and their customers a thrilling amount of deniability. A Phoenician merchant stopped by a Persian official for wearing a cloak of Tyrian purple, a color famously expensive and often restricted to nobility, could simply shrug and claim it was a failed batch, a happy accident of the dyeing process. He could feign ignorance or play the role of the status-obsessed social climber, all while secretly wearing the uniform of his defiance. This act of sartorial subversion turned every public space into a potential stage for protest. The agora, the temple steps, the bustling docks, all became runways where identity and allegiance were communicated not through shouted slogans, but through a silent, stunning visual language of color. It was resistance that was both deeply personal, worn on one's very skin, and magnificently public, a flag waved in the face of authority without ever needing a pole. The dyer's vat, therefore, was more than a site of production. It was a crucible where aesthetics and politics fused, proving that the fight for freedom could be as vibrant and multifaceted as the most brilliantly dyed cloth. Now let us set sail from the colorful, land-based rebellions and venture out onto the open, unpredictable ocean, where a different kind of resistance was being tied, quite literally, knot by knot. For ancient sailors, life was a constant negotiation with the immense, impersonal power of the sea. Their survival depended on trust, skill, and an intimate knowledge of their craft, with the humble rope and the knots that secured it being their absolute lifeline. A poorly tied knot could mean a lost sail, a collapsed mast, or a ship swallowed by a storm. This environment of mutual dependence and constant danger fostered a culture of intense solidarity and unbreakable loyalty among crews. And it was within this closed, floating world that the sailor's knot evolved from a simple piece of practical seamanship into a sophisticated language of rebellion, a silent code that could bind men together in mutiny as firmly as it bound the ship's timbers together. The potential for unrest was ever present on ancient voyages. Sailors, often pressed into service or living under the tyrannical rule of a cruel captain, faced brutal conditions, poor food, and the constant threat of punishment. In such a pressurized environment, open discussion of grievance was impossible. A whisper could be carried on the wind to the wrong ears. This is where the knot became their perfect medium. The intricate, centuries-old art of knot tying provided an entire lexicon of shapes and patterns that were completely innocuous to any officer scanning the decks. A sailor casually coiling a rope on the deck might finish it with a specific, complex knot known only to his conspirators. To the captain, it looked like a sailor idly practicing his craft. But to another initiated crewman, that knot was a clear message. The plan is set. Be ready to act at the next watch. Another knot left in the rigging could signal that a particular officer was being watched, or that a stash of extra water or weapons had been secured. This was a communication system that left no written record, required no sound, and was conducted in full view of the very people it was designed to overthrow. The symbolism of the knot itself was powerfully resonant. A well-tied knot is defined by its strength and its complexity. It gains its power from the interweaving of multiple strands, each one relying on the others to hold the whole structure fast. This was a perfect metaphor for the mutiny they were planning. Just as a knot is stronger than a single strand of rope, their collective will was stronger than any single individual. The act of tying a knot together, of physically weaving their fates into an unbreakable bond, was a powerful ritual of commitment. It represented their understanding that their survival and their success depended entirely on their ability to trust one another absolutely. The knot meant that there was no turning back. They were all bound together for better or worse. This deep, symbolic meaning transformed their practical skill into a profound political statement about unity and collective action against a corrupt authority. Archaeological evidence pulled from the depths of ancient shipwrecks provides tantalizing clues to this practice. While rope itself rarely survives millennia underwater, the stone and ceramic weights used with nets and rigging often do. In several wrecks across the Mediterranean, particularly those dating to periods known for naval unrest, archaeologists have recovered these weights and found them meticulously wrapped and secured with rope impressions that reveal unusually complex, non-utilitarian knot patterns. These are not the simple, efficient knots used for everyday seafaring. They are elaborate, almost decorative weaves that would have taken extra time and care to execute. The most plausible explanation is that these were purposefully tied, serving as fixed, permanent symbols of a crew's allegiance, or perhaps even marking a ship that had already been taken over by its sailors and was now sailing under a new, unofficial command. These silent sentinels from the deep confirm that the sailor's knot was far more than a tool. It was a promise woven in fiber, a binding agreement made between desperate men on the vast, unforgiving sea, a testament to the fact that the tightest bonds are often those forged in the struggle for a common freedom. Out on the open sea, where the horizon was a constant and the deck a fragile world of wood and rope, survival depended on a deep, unspoken trust and a mastery of the ship itself. In this confined, all-male society, ruled by the often arbitrary authority of a captain, the tools of the trade took on a second, hidden life. The humble rope and the knots that gave it purpose were more than just practical necessities. They became a silent language, a way to tie bonds of rebellion right under the nose of an oppressive commander. For sailors who might be pressed into service or subjected to brutal discipline, the intricate art of knot tying offered a perfect, deniable method of communication. A specific knot left in the rigging or a particular way of coiling a line on deck could convey a complex message as clearly as a shouted order, but without any sound at all. This was a language only the initiated could understand, a code woven in hemp and muscle memory that turned every part of the ship into a potential bulletin board for conspiracy. The sheer complexity of nautical knots made this system incredibly effective. A captain or officer would see a sailor diligently practicing his knots, a common sight on any long voyage, and think nothing of it. But the shape being formed by those calloused hands could be a deliberate signal. One famously complex knot, like a doubled carrack bend or an elaborately finished monkey's fist, might be left in a highly visible place to indicate that the planning for a mutiny was complete and that the conspirators should stand ready. A simpler knot, like a sheet bend with an extra tuck, could be a warning that a particular trusted officer was nearby and that all covert conversation should cease. The beauty of this system was its complete invisibility to authority. You couldn't arrest a man for tying a knot correctly, even if that knot was screaming treason across the deck to everyone in the know. It was resistance conducted in plain sight, using the very skills that made the sailor valuable to the vessel he was preparing to take over. This practice speaks to a profound truth about life at sea. Trust was the most valuable currency in that floating world. Organizing a mutiny was an act of incredible risk, where a single informant could doom everyone involved. The act of teaching a fellow sailor a secret knot, of literally tying a bond of trust between them, was a powerful ritual of commitment. It was a way of saying, I am placing my life in your hands and you are placing yours in mine. The knot itself became the perfect symbol for this. A single strand of rope is weak, but when interwoven with others into a complex knot, it becomes stronger than the sum of its parts. Their plan, like the knot, would only hold if every strand played its part and maintained tension. This deep, symbolic understanding transformed a mundane seafaring skill into the foundation of a brotherhood built on the shared desire for freedom and fair treatment. While the organic fibers of these ropes have almost always vanished into the sea, archaeology has provided us with tantalizing, indirect evidence. In several ancient shipwrecks across the Mediterranean, archaeologists have recovered heavy stone and ceramic weights used for nets and rigging. What makes some of these objects remarkable are the very clear impressions left in the concretion around them, the ghostly shadows of the ropes that once bound them. In a few notable cases, these impressions reveal not simple, utilitarian knots, but incredibly intricate, almost decorative weaves that would have served no practical purpose for securing a weight. These complex patterns, frozen in time, are strongly believed to be evidence of this very practice, a permanent, symbolic knot tied by a crew to mark an allegiance or perhaps even to signify that the ship itself had been taken and was now under the command of its sailors. These silent echoes of rope and resolve remind us that the most powerful acts of defiance are often those that are silently woven, tying together the frayed ends of injustice into a new, unbreakable bond of solidarity. But while the sailors not tied bonds of solidarity on the open sea, another tool was being used to mend the wounds of rebellion on land, offering a different kind of strength, one rooted not in confrontation but in care. In the quiet corners of an ancient healer's hut, away from the clamor of battle and the tension of secret meetings, the rhythmic, circular grinding of a pestle against a mortar would have been a familiar, comforting sound. This was the sound of medicine being made, of pain being alleviated, of life being sustained. The mortar and pestle, a simple pair of tools for crushing and combining herbs, were universal symbols of healing and compassion. Yet, in times of violent oppression, when rebels were wounded and communities were under siege, these same instruments of care were quietly conscripted into the struggle, becoming silent partners in resistance and proving that the act of healing could itself be a radical and defiant act. In ancient Greece, particularly during periods of political turmoil and tyranny, the role of the healer often extended far beyond that of a simple physician. These men and women, knowledgeable in the properties of local plants, operated in a dangerous gray area. They were duty-bound to ease suffering, but offering aid to a wounded rebel was a treasonous offense that could mean execution. This forced them to become masters of subterfuge, and the mortar and pestle became their perfect tools for it. Preparing a poultice for a sword wound or a tea for fever was a common, innocuous sight. But within that legitimate cover, a healer could grind something else into the mixture, a tiny, tightly rolled scrap of papyrus, a message warning of a planned raid, the location of a safe house, or the identity of a traitor could be hidden within a ball of healing resin or folded into a packet of dried herbs. Delivering this medicine to a specific person allowed information to travel through official checkpoints without arousing suspicion. The very act of creating a remedy was thus transformed into an act of espionage, with the mortar serving as the mixing bowl for both healing salves and liberation plots. The physical process of using the tool itself provided a powerful metaphor that resonated deeply with those fighting for freedom. The action of grinding, of applying persistent, circular pressure to break down tough roots and seeds into a fine, potent powder, perfectly mirrored the psychological process of resistance. It represented the slow, steady, determined effort required to break down a seemingly unbreakable oppressive power. A single herb might have little effect, but when several were ground together in the mortar, they created a medicine far more powerful than any single ingredient. This was a perfect analogy for a rebel movement. Individual acts of defiance might seem insignificant, but when combined and ground together by shared purpose, they could create a force powerful enough to challenge any authority. The healer at work with their pestle was, in a very real sense, demonstrating the very principle of collective resilience. This symbolic role has left its mark on the archaeological record. In excavations across the ancient world, from Thrace to Egypt, stone and ceramic mortars have been discovered that bear faint but deliberate inscriptions. These are not the maker's marks or notations of contents one might expect. Instead, some are etched with symbols of protection, an eye to ward off evil, a coiled serpent for healing, but others feature more overtly political symbols. A tiny owl, the symbol of Athena and Athenian democracy, has been found scratched into the base of a mortar in a region known for anti-tyranny sentiment. Another was found with a small, etched image of a broken spear. These markings were hidden on the bottom or the inside of the bowl, places where only the healer would see them. They were private affirmations, a way for the healer to consecrate their tool not just to the god of medicine, but to the cause of freedom. Each time they ground herbs, they were physically connecting their healing art to their political defiance, a silent prayer for strength etched in stone. The legacy of the mortar and pestle ultimately reminds us that resistance is not a monolithic concept. It is not solely the domain of the warrior with a sword or the sailor with a cunning knot. It exists equally in the hands of the caregiver, the one who tends to the broken and keeps the community healthy enough to continue the fight. This tool embodies the profound idea that preserving life is the most fundamental rejection of tyranny. To heal a rebel was to directly counter the state's attempt to inflict terror and death. It was to declare that every life had value and would be fought for. The mortar and pestle teach us that rebellion is not just about opposing something. It is also about protecting and nurturing something. It is about grinding down the forces of oppression while simultaneously grinding together the ingredients for a healthier, more resilient future, proving that care and defiance are not opposites, but are in fact two sides of the very same coin. Now let's step out of the healer's hut and into the vast, open wilderness, where survival depended not on the grinding of herbs, but on the silent, tension-filled release of an arrow. For ancient nomadic and hunter-gatherer societies, the bow was far more than a weapon. It was the ultimate instrument of autonomy. It represented the skill to feed one's family, the knowledge to navigate and belong to a territory, and the freedom to live beyond the walls and laws of settled kingdoms. This profound connection to independence meant that when expanding empires or greedy chieftains sought to restrict hunting rights or seize ancestral lands, the hunter's bow was naturally transformed. It evolved from a tool for claiming game into a powerful symbol for claiming sovereignty, its taut string humming with the tension between a way of life and the forces that sought to end it. The conflict often arose from a fundamental clash of worldviews. For a settled agricultural state, land was a commodity to be owned, mapped, taxed, and its resources controlled. Wild game was the property of the king or the local lord, and hunting was a regulated privilege, not a universal right. But for a nomadic hunter, the land was a relative, a provider, and a sacred trust. The bow was the key that unlocked its bounty, and the skill to use it was a rite of passage that defined manhood and community membership. When a state decreed that certain forests were now royal hunting preserves off-limits to local tribes, or that all game belonged to the ruling class, they weren't just passing a law, they were launching a direct attack on a people's entire identity and survival strategy. In response, the act of hunting itself became a political act. To skillfully track and take a deer in a forbidden forest was no longer just about food. It was a breathtakingly risky declaration of independence, a silent arrow shot directly into the heart of the imposed law. This defiance was often formalized in powerful rituals that elevated the bow from a physical object to a sacred emblem. In many nomadic cultures across the Eurasian steppes and the North American woodlands, the bow was central to ceremonies that affirmed tribal identity and sovereignty. A young man's first successful hunt was celebrated not just as a personal achievement, but as a renewal of the community's covenant with the land and its traditional rights. During disputes with emissaries from settled powers, tribal leaders would sometimes perform a potent symbolic gesture, the breaking of a bow. This was not an act of surrender, but a devastatingly eloquent statement. A bow was a painstakingly crafted object, its power dependent on its perfect integrity. To snap it in two during a negotiation over broken treaties or stolen lands was a visceral, unforgettable metaphor. It signified that the agreement between the people and the power was shattered, and that the delicate balance that allowed them to live had been irrevocably destroyed by the greed of the other party. The broken bow screamed what words could not: "Your actions have broken our world." The bow's unique design also made it a perfect metaphor for the strategy of resistance employed by these communities. Unlike the brute force of a club or the broad sweep of a sword, the bow required precision, patience, and focus. Its power was not in uncontrolled fury, but in carefully aimed impact. This mirrored the most effective tactics of these often outnumbered groups. They could not win in a pitched battle against a legion or a royal army. Instead, they relied on targeted, symbolic actions that achieved maximum psychological effect with minimal risk. A perfectly aimed arrow could take down a key official, or a well-executed raid could liberate captured livestock. The bow thus represented a philosophy of resistance that valued intelligence and accuracy over overwhelming force. It was a reminder that a single, well-placed act of defiance, like a single well-placed arrow, could sometimes change the course of events far more effectively than 1,000 unfocused blows. The hunter's story teaches us that the tools of survival carry within them the wisdom of their use, a wisdom that can be applied to the struggle for justice, aiming not just to win a conflict, but to protect an entire way of life. But while the hunter's bow took aim from the wilderness, another instrument of defiance was being wielded in the quiet, dust-filled scriptoriums of the ancient world. In the heart of vast empires like Persia, where the power of the king was considered absolute and his word was law, the humble inkpot held a paradoxical power. This small, often ceramic vessel, filled with a mixture of soot, gum, and water, was the wellspring of the bureaucratic machine. It was used to record taxes, draft decrees, and inscribe the official version of history that would be sent to every corner of the realm. Yet, in the hands of a courageous or disgruntled scribe, this same tool of state control could be turned against its masters. The inkpot became a silent arsenal for ideological rebellion, a means to pour out truth in a desert of propaganda and ensure that the whispers of dissent would be granted the permanence of ink on papyrus or vellum. The life of a scribe in such an empire was one of intense pressure and contradiction. They were the guardians of information, highly educated and acutely aware of the gap between the state's glorious proclamations and the grim reality of its policies. To alter a document openly was tantamount to suicide, inviting brutal execution. So, their resistance became an art form of subtlety and cunning. A scribe might be tasked with copying a royal edict that boasted of a great military victory. As his reed pen dipped into the inkpot, he could make a tiny, almost imperceptible change. He might omit a standard honorific title for the king, or slightly alter a number to reduce the count of enemy dead, subtly undermining the scale of the triumph. In economic records, a list of tributes extracted from an impoverished region could be annotated with a tiny, discreet symbol, a single drop, perhaps, drawn next to the total, a silent, enduring protest against the human suffering that number represented. These were acts of incredible bravery, a high-stakes game of altering reality, one carefully inked character at a time, using the state's own tools to etch doubt into its foundation. The inkpot's power lay in its ability to create a permanent record. While a spoken word of protest could be denied or forgotten, a written word, hidden in an archive or passed hand to hand, could survive for centuries. This made the inkpot a potent symbol of truth's endurance. Scribes understood that they were not just recording events, they were shaping the narrative that would be passed down to future generations. In Persia, where the royal archives were meticulously kept, a scribe sympathetic to a suppressed religious sect or a deposed noble family might take a tremendous risk. He could use his access and his ink to create a second, secret record, a scroll that told the story from the perspective of the vanquished, not the victor. This alternative history would then be carefully hidden, a time capsule of dissent waiting for a future era to discover it. The inkpot, in this context, was not just a holder of ink, it was a vessel for memory, ensuring that a silenced voice could still speak across the ages. Some of the most fascinating archaeological evidence of this comes from discoveries of the inkpots themselves. In excavations of ancient administrative centers, a few rare inkpots have been found with ingenious modifications. Certain double-walled ceramic inkpots have been discovered, with a small, hidden compartment sealed between the inner and outer layers. This space, utterly undetectable when the pot was filled with ink, could be used to conceal a tiny, rolled scrap of parchment containing a secret message or a list of names. Another inkpot, recovered from a site in the former Persian Empire, was found to have a false bottom. Beneath a thin layer of clay lay a small space containing a handful of uncut gemstones, likely the scribe's secret savings or perhaps payment for services rendered in a clandestine information network. These artifacts transform the inkpot from a simple desk accessory into a sophisticated tool of espionage. They are physical proof that the battle for information was being waged with ingenuity and courage, right under the noses of the most powerful empires on Earth. The inkpot's legacy is a powerful reminder that those who control the narrative control the world, but that the pen and the pot that feeds it can be mightier than the sword. If the sickle was the hidden blade of individual defiance, then the scythe was its grand, sweeping counterpart, the standard raised high above a united front. Picture the difference. A sickle is wielded in one hand, its work intimate and close to the earth, suited for carefully cutting clusters of grain. But the scythe is a tool of expansive, powerful motion. With its long, two-handed handle and a dramatically curved blade as long as a man's arm, it is designed for a relentless, rhythmic swing that clears entire swaths of a field in a single day. This shift in scale, from the personal to the collective, is precisely what transformed the scythe into one of history's most imposing and potent symbols of mass uprising. It was no longer just a tool for harvesting wheat. It became the embodiment of the harvesters themselves, moving in unison, their shared labor and shared grievances made visible in a single, formidable object. While its most iconic appearances would come later, in medieval peasant revolts like the Jacquerie in France or the German Peasants' War, the symbolic roots of the scythe as an emblem of justice are deeply ancient. The tool's very design speaks to a philosophy of collective effort. Using a scythe effectively is a skill that requires coordination and rhythm. In a harvest crew, each worker must move in sync with the others to avoid injury and maximize the yield. This inherent need for harmony and mutual dependence made the scythe a perfect metaphor for the social contract itself. To raise a scythe in protest was to physically represent this idea. We are the ones whose coordinated labor feeds the nation. Our strength is our unity, and we are now swinging that unity against you. The long handle gave the wielder a commanding presence, allowing the blade to be held aloft like a banner, its sun-bleached wood and polished steel catching the light, a terrifying and beautiful sight that announced the arrival of the common people's power. This symbolism was powerfully reinforced by the scythe's intimate connection to the most fundamental natural cycles. Ancient agrarian societies lived and died by the seasons of planting, growth, and harvest. The scythe was the instrument that closed this sacred loop, the tool that finally claimed the fruits of a year's worth of sun, rain, and backbreaking toil. Because of this, it became inextricably linked to concepts of natural justice and reciprocity, the universal law that effort should be rewarded with sustenance. When landlords, tax collectors, or corrupt officials broke this law by seizing an unfair share of the harvest, they weren't just committing an economic crime, they were violating a cosmic order. The scythe, in response, was transformed. In the hands of an angry crowd, it was no longer just fulfilling its seasonal duty. It was being wielded to enforce that natural law, to literally reap the justice that had been sown but denied. Its sweeping arc became the physical manifestation of a moral correction, cutting down the weeds of corruption to restore balance to the field. This potent imagery ensured the scythe a prominent place not just in real-world uprisings, but in the art and stories that grew from them. Folk tales and songs from across Europe are filled with the figure of the determined reaper, his scythe over his shoulder, marching to confront the unjust lord. In woodcuts and paintings depicting peasant revolts, the scythe is everywhere, not always as a weapon of war, but as a central, unmistakable symbol of the protesters' identity and their righteous cause. Often, these depictions show the scythes being held upright, their blades pointing to the sky like a forest of metal leaves, a powerful visual declaration that the people who worked the land were now standing tall upon it, demanding to be seen and heard. The tool's journey from the field to the front lines of a rally illustrates a profound evolution in symbolic resistance. It shows how the grievances of individuals, when woven together by shared experience, can be scaled up into a collective demand for change, using the most familiar objects of daily life to articulate a vision of a fairer world. What emerges from these 25 symbols is not a collection of random acts, but a powerful, repeating pattern of human behavior under pressure. It's a pattern that reveals a universal truth. When people are pushed to the brink, they don't just reach for weapons, they reach for meaning. They instinctively grasp the objects most deeply woven into their identity and daily survival, and they begin a remarkable process of symbolic alchemy, transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary. This transformation consistently follows three profound and interconnected paths, each one a testament to a different facet of the human spirit's response to oppression. The first and most immediate thread is the breathtaking creativity of repurposing. This isn't merely about using a sickle as a weapon instead of a harvesting tool. It's about a fundamental reimagining of an object's very essence. The spindle shifts from a symbol of domestic confinement to a banner of economic power. The quiet glow of an oil lamp becomes a coordinated signal of collective defiance against a curfew. A simple basket used for carrying figs to market is ingeniously redesigned with a false bottom to smuggle messages past Roman checkpoints. This creativity is born from a place of profound limitation. These were not people with the resources to forge new weapons or print pamphlets. They were individuals who had to make do with what was already in their hands. And in that constraint, they found incredible freedom of thought. It demonstrates that the human mind, when faced with a wall, will not always try to break it down sometimes. It will learn to write a secret message on it that only its allies can read. This leads us directly to the second thread, the deep connection to livelihood and economic justice. Notice how many of these symbols are not just objects, but the very means of production. The plow, the scythe, the fisherman's net, the blacksmith's hammer, the millstone, these are the tools that built the ancient world, that fed cities, that clothed armies. When the people who wielded these tools felt that the economic system was extracting their labor without offering dignity or fair reward in return, their rebellion was not an abstract political idea. It was a deeply personal and material act. Brandishing a baker's peel in a bread riot or deliberately damaging a millstone was a direct, visceral argument about the right to the fruits of one's own labor. It was a way of physically demonstrating, you may own this mill, but you cannot run it without us. You may claim this harvest, but we are the ones who grew it. This form of resistance is rooted in the body, in the ache of muscles and the grumble of an empty stomach, making it one of the most powerful and morally clear demands in human history. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we see the consistent, brilliant use of symbolism as a shield. Open rebellion against an empire or a tyrant was often suicide. So the oppressed became masters of coded communication, developing a silent language that flew under the radar of their oppressors. This is where the psychological depth of these acts truly shines. A Minoan potter embedding a scene of communal labor into a vase wasn't just making art, he was promoting an entire anti-hierarchical ideology. A Celtic leatherworker etching a tiny protective rune into a Roman officer's saddle wasn't just sabotaging equipment, he was performing a spiritual act of resistance, a small prayer for protection hidden in plain sight. These symbolic acts served a dual purpose. They were a safe way to coordinate action, but they were also a vital way to maintain mental and cultural autonomy. In a world that sought to break their spirit and erase their identity, the act of weaving a secret pattern into a textile or singing a forbidden song with a coded rhythm was a way to say, "You may control my body, but you will never own my mind. My culture, my beliefs, and my hope are my own, and I will keep them alive in the only ways left to me." This symbolic warfare ensured that even in defeat, the seeds of a culture could be preserved, waiting for a more favorable season to sprout again. Together, these three threads weave a story far richer than a simple chronology of revolts. They show us that ancient resistance was a sophisticated, multifaceted struggle fought on the battlegrounds of economics, psychology, and identity. The loom, the ledger, and the lute were just as important as the sword. By understanding these patterns, we stop seeing history as a series of isolated explosions of violence and start seeing it as it truly was: a continuous, resilient, and endlessly creative human struggle for dignity, a struggle that used the most humble of tools to carve its message into the foundations of time itself. From spindles to scythes, the ordinary tools of ancient times carried extraordinary weight as symbols of resistance, reminding us that defiance often springs from the very items we use daily. These relics teach us about the resilience of the human spirit, the power of collective action, and the ingenious ways people have always found to challenge injustice. As we look around our own world, consider what modern objects might someday be seen as symbols of today's struggles, perhaps a smartphone or a protest sign. History shows that even the most mundane tools can become icons of change when wielded with purpose and unity. Thank you for joining this journey into the past. If this video inspired you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more explorations into historical